We're going to go ahead and get started. My name's David Drews. I'm the research coordinator with the University of Nebraska's Center for Public Affairs Research. I'll be your moderator for this particular session. With that, we do hope you enjoyed the 9 o'clock session that was about the 2020 census. This particular session extends upon that or builds upon it and talks about the actual data that we're going to be receiving once census results are tabulated. Our first speaker will be James Whitehorn, who's with the U.S. Census Bureau. When he's done, we'll turn it over to Elizabeth Garner, who is the state demographer for Colorado and has done a lot of research on this particular topic, including something called differential privacy. And if you haven't heard that term yet as a data user, that's why you're at this conference, so that you can learn about these types of things that will be impacting you as these census results get released. So you'll be ahead of the game and ready to work within those data that are released. So let me introduce our first speaker. James Whitehorn is the chief of the Census Redistricting and Voting Rights Data Office. He manages the redistricting data program, which will provide some of our first local data from the 2020 census. He's the leading expert on this topic, and I'm anxious to hear all that he's going to share with us. With no further ado, here's James Whitehorn.
So I want to say thank you to the Nebraska Data Users Conference and David in particular for giving me the invite to come and speak with you all today. I'm very happy to be here and be speaking with Elizabeth, who I also have some history with because she's an official liaison to the redistricting program from Colorado. So it's nice to actually be able to see you again, Elizabeth, and be able to share the stage with you. I'm going to talk about a few things today. I've got a lot packed in here, so I'm going to go through it pretty quickly to try to make sure we have some time for questions. I'm going to highlight the redistricting data program specifically. That's my area of expertise, and I also think that it's a critical data set. Then I'm going to talk about a little bit about the other data products coming from the 2020 census, just very shortly with what I know and what I can share. And then I'm going to do sort of an introduction around differential privacy and why the Census Bureau is implementing that without going into too many of the details of the implementation itself. So I like to say, start these with a little discussion about the differentiation between apportionment and redistricting. These are two things that oftentimes get conflated, and even to the point that sometimes it makes it into certain states' laws. And they're very different data products. Apportionment is a simple state count that's used for dividing up seats in Congress. The redistricting data is the detailed data at detailed levels of geography that's needed for conducting legislative redistricting. So I just want to make sure that folks are clear that those are two different products. The redistricting data program itself is established under Public Law 94-171. And it's actually a fairly simple charge. We're charged with allowing the states to identify the small area geography that they need to conduct legislative redistricting. Over history, those small areas have been identified as census blocks and voting districts, which is just a generic word we have for precincts or wards, and then legislative and congressional districts. The role of the program is to establish the criteria for doing that geographic exchange, for identifying the required tabulations that we need to produce to provide back to the states. A very important part of the program, sort of an umbrella part of the program, is that we have to conduct it in a nonpartisan manner. And the way we do this is we reach out to the legislatures in each state. And although things are a little different in Nebraska, we typically go to the majority and minority of both parties in both chambers, if you have two chambers, or just the single chamber, and the governor's office, and get someone assigned or someone's assigned that can represent the state in a nonpartisan manner. They don't have to be nonpartisan, they just have to be able to represent the state in a nonpartisan manner. And then we work with them throughout the course of the program. And then finally, our final charge is to deliver the tabulations for those small areas and other areas to the governor and the officers or public bodies with the initial responsibility for legislative apportionment or districting in each state, no later than 1 year from census day. So from this census, that would be April 1st of 2021. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a later slide. The folks that we've interpreted as being the recipients for this data are the governor, the state legislative leadership, and then any redistricting commissioners that have been already established. So recognizing the importance of being prepared for redistricting and knowing that oftentimes once the data comes out, states have a very short amount of time in which to do their work. The Census Bureau for the last several decades has created what we call prototype data. So people have an idea of what's coming. We did it off our dress rehearsals for the last two censuses, and then for this census, we conducted an end-to-end test in Providence, Rhode Island, and we created products from those and put them out within a one-year time frame from that test. We put the prototype geographic products out in February of last year and the prototype tabulations in March. So anyone can go on the web, go to my office's website, look at these files. They can see what types of data we're going to be delivering. They can see what the fields are going to be in the tables. They can see what the geographic support products will be. All the examples are for Providence, Rhode Island, because that's where the test was conducted, but they do give you an insight into what can be expected. So then the official delivery dates, our original plan with the 2020 census was to get the geographic products out to the states between November 20th and February 1st of 21. And then of course the statutory requirement to get the data out sometime between February 18th and March 31st of 2021. That was our original plan. Of course, COVID-19 has happened. A lot of replanning is being done. We're now undergoing a second replanning to make sure that we can make the apportionment counts on December 31st or by December 31st. And we're still working through the schedules to see when we can get that redistricting data out. As soon as we get a nice solid plan to get the apportionment data out on time, we'll be putting together a schedule to get that redistricting data out by April 1st of 2021, if that's possible, while maintaining the quality that's necessary for that data file. Just to give you a brief example of what kind of geographic products we provide, we give shape files. These are the cartographic boundary files for use in a geographic information system. We do maps. These are large sheet PDF maps. We do county block maps, which shows every single census block within a county, sometimes on one sheet, sometimes on multiple sheets, depending on the complexity of the county. State legislative with voting district maps that shows the voting districts nested within the state legislative district so people can see those relationships. Census tract maps, which are often helpful for people who are looking at things over time, and then school district maps. We also have a block assignment file table. This is just tabular listings of all the blocks in the state and to which geographies they belong. So it answers the question of what blocks are in my county, what blocks are in my place. It's useful as a crosswalk for crosswalking data if you're trying to work outside of GIS. And then finally, something that's not in those prototype products because it requires the creation of the 2020 census blocks are these block-to-block relationship files. These are the crosswalks between the 2010 blocks and the 2020 blocks. But the data itself, the counts, that's what most people are really interested in. And for those of you who've worked with the redistricting data before, this should look very familiar. We have the table P1, which is race. We have the race for the voting age population. We have Hispanic or Latino or not Hispanic or Latino by race. And then we have the same for the voting age population. We have a housing unit count table, which has housing units identified by their occupancy status, whether they're occupied or vacant. But we did add a new table this decade called the group quarters population by group quarters type. And if you're not familiar with census data, group quarters are things like correctional institutions for adults, college, university, student housing, military quarters, things like that. And this was put into place on the redistricting file because many states now have a legal requirement on their state statute level to reallocate people from those group quarters where they're counted back to a previous address. So there's about 9 states now that move prisoners from the prison back to a pre-incarceration address. Hawaii moves military and students around. And up until Kansas modified their constitution in 2018, there was a requirement for Kansas to move students and military around. So to give you an idea of what's in these tables, table P1 and P3, which are the race and race for the voting age population, have the same structure. We just substitute what's called the universe. So in the race table, we're looking at the total population. And in the race for the voting age population, we're looking at the total population that's 18 and over. But the iterations of how they're reported is the same. And as you can see at the slide on the screen, if someone only declares one race, they go into a population one race and then whatever category that they've chosen. If they choose 2 races, then they go into the population of 2 races and then whichever 2 categories they've chosen. And we go through that iteration over and over through 3 or more, 4 or more, 5 or more, until we get to where someone has chosen all 6 races as to who they belong. A very similar situation for the Hispanic or not Latino and not Hispanic or Latino by race. We take the total population for the P2 table, or we take the total population 18 and over. And then you can see here the one main difference between this table and the previous one is the total that has the first grouping as Hispanic or Latino. So if anyone chooses to identify as their ethnicity as being Hispanic or Latino, they get put into that category. And then the remainder of people who have said that they are not Hispanic or Latino are then iterated in these race categories exactly the same way as indicated in table P1 and P3. The occupancy status table is very simple. It's just a count of the total number of housing units and then which ones are occupied and which ones are vacant. The group quarters table that I mentioned, it's also a very simple table because it only does total population. There's no characteristics. There's no racial characteristics. There's no age characteristics. Certain age characteristics can be inferred when things say correctional facility for adult, that type of thing. But in general, this is just total population. And then it's broken out by these different major group quarters types. So to get this data out the door and get it in the hands of the official recipients, who, as I mentioned, are the governors, legislative leadership, and redistricting commissions, we're doing two things. One, we're going to overnight physical media. It's going to be on DVD and flash drive. And this will go to those folks I mentioned. And the DVD and flash drive have the same information. We're just doing it both ways. I know that our census laptops no longer have DVD drives. And we think that that's probably pretty common, that that's a technology on the way out. So we're just doing both copies by overnight mail. The morning that that is supposed to arrive, there will be what we call an embargoed access to the data.census.gov platform. That's the new replacement for the American Fact Finder. So we'll work with the official recipients in advance to get them signed up for these embargo accounts. So because it does require pre-registration, but the morning those physical media are supposed to arrive, we'll open up that embargo so that they can go in and also look at it through the data.census.gov platform. As soon as we monitor that web traffic or the mail tracking numbers that show that the data has been received, we'll be contacting them to make sure that they have received the data and have been able to access it, so we can ensure that we're satisfying our legal requirement to deliver the data to this audience. For the public, the day after it's received by the official recipients and we can confirm that they've received it, the next morning we'll flip the switch and it'll go out to the public. The public will have the full access to the data.census.gov versions of this data. And we've done something as a requirement specifically for the redistricting data program to allow large data download. This will allow you to go in, pick whatever state you want, pick all the tables in the PL schema, the P1 through P5 and the H1 table, and you can download them all at once for all blocks within the largest state. We're currently in final testing of that functionality, and it does appear that it will be working. So people will be able to easily grab all blocks within their state. We're also going to put out our traditional summary file where it has the relational database tables with the geoheader and then the data segments that you can link up and then have access to every single summary level that's within that data set. We did have to add a new data segment to fit in that group quarters table, so there's now 3 data segments instead of 2. And another important organizational change is these are now pipe delimited files. In the past, they were comment delimited for the data segments and fixed width for the geoheader, but now all of these files are pipe delimited to try to make it easier for data users. So now I'm going to switch over to the 2020 census data products themselves. One product that's of great interest, and I was asked to include in this, is a discussion around the citizen voting age population by race and ethnicity. This is an annual tabulation that we've been producing from the American Community Survey, 5-year estimates since 2011. We've produced it for a decade now. The last one we published was in February of 2020, typically in the first week of February. And it's a simple tabulation, sort of summarized from what you would expect to see in the PL table. And it's designed, it was requested by the Department of Justice to help them with enforcement of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. But for the 2020 census, we're going to be doing this using administrative records and the 2020 census frame. So we'll be able to take administrative records and create this data set. And that does 2 things. One, we had to make some modifications to make sure that this matched up to the 2020 census data. So you'll see that there's an asterisk on 2 items. In the content, some other race alone is not a category that we use in the ACS, for the American Community Survey, but it is one we use in the decennial census. So we've added that category to this content. And then the geography. The American Community Survey only goes down to the block group. And so we only produce that table at the block group level when we're creating it from the American Community Survey. But since we'll be creating this from the 2020 census frame, we'll be able to create it all the way down to the block level. So that's the two changes there. Now, I was hoping to be able to have a lot more definitive information for you around our product calendar. As you know, by watching the news, the Census Bureau is dealing with the challenges of COVID-19 and many other challenges that have been put in front of the Census Bureau. We're currently working to ensure that we're meeting our deadline of December 31st for the apportionment counts. As you can see, in 2010, we were able to get those out on the 21st of December. The redistricting data we put out in February and March of 2011. We're still working to make sure that we can meet those dates. We're working to design a schedule, and that work is being done with March 31st as the deadline. So we're working to make sure that we can meet that deadline. We just haven't finished doing that work, so I have it as a TBD until we do complete that. The date that you see for 4/14 of 2011, that's what we call the national redistricting file. That is just sort of a supplementary file that contains the same data as what you find in PL 94-171 for geographies that cross state boundaries, like American Indian areas, some metropolitan areas, things like that. In general, the Census Bureau has been trying to follow the timeline from the 2020 census releases. We do have new challenges that we need to overcome. Both in the implementation of our disclosure avoidance system and also, of course, these reschedulings for the creation of other products that we're working through right now. So I can't say for certain when these products will be delivered, but I did want to point out something here in what we call the Group 1 products. We have a demographic and housing characteristic file. You may recognize most of the content of that file as being very similar to what was in Summary File 1. It is not an exact replica of Summary File 1. There have been some design choices of what goes in there and at what levels of geography it's produced to help us accommodate our new disclosure avoidance system and the privacy guarantees that we're trying to make sure that we can make. The one product that I'm fairly certain of, as long as we get the data out by March 31st for redistricting, is that we'll be collecting the 118th congressional districts after they're created by the states, and we'll be putting those in and creating a retabulation of that demographic and housing characteristic file in spring of 2023. So now I'm going to switch gears to differential privacy in the 2020 census. And I hope you'll indulge me. I have to rely on my notes a little more for this. This is not my primary area of expertise. But the Census Bureau's commitment to privacy and confidentiality is critical to our ability to produce high quality statistics about the nation's people and economy. Protecting the privacy of our respondents and the confidentiality of their data is both a legal requirement and it's also a cultural and institutional culture that we have at the Census Bureau. Everything that we collect or receive about our respondents is protected under Title 13 of Section 9 of the United States Code. Oftentimes we just refer to it as Title 13. But it prohibits the Census Bureau from releasing identifiable data furnished by any particular establishment or individual. We're sworn to life to protect this data, and unlawful disclosure can result in severe fines of up to $250,000 and 5 years in jail. So we have a challenge. The challenge we face is that we collect all this information to fulfill our mission to produce quality statistics about the nation, but information tabulated from the census is used for many things. Like we mentioned apportionment, we mentioned drawing redistricting boundaries, but it's also used to distribute over $675 billion each year. Census data are used for critical decision-making by other government agencies, by policymakers, businesses, analysts, researchers. It's really one of the most widely used data sets in the country. So to support all of these uses requires publishing an enormous amount of statistics and tables, and often down to very small geography, very fine levels of granularity. Unfortunately, we now know that every time you publish any statistic calculated from confidential data, you leak a little bit of the private information in the process. In 2003, in what later became known as the database reconstruction theorem, Dinner and Neeson demonstrated that if you release too many statistics at too high a degree of accuracy, you'll eventually reveal the entire underlying confidential data source. This challenge is even greater when you consider the privacy threats that we face today. They say that nothing on the internet ever goes away, and the same can be said for data that's been put out into the public arena. Over the past 20 or 30 years, there's been a massive proliferation of data that can potentially be used to re-identify individuals in our statistical products. Data about us are collected all the time by the companies we interact with, data brokers, social media, plus all of the personal data that's been compromised through invasion of systems from people with less purposeful purposes. And that data could be used to pick out specific individuals in the data that we publish. So meanwhile, the technology's improved. Computers can easily perform complex matching algorithms, and these are real concrete threats that the Census Bureau needs to make sure we address. So over the past century, we've been a leader in the design and implementation of statistical methods to safeguard privacy in public data releases. As new threats have been identified, the Census Bureau has worked hard to ensure that statistical safeguards are in place to mitigate those threats. And we adopted formal privacy, which is another name for differential privacy, for the 2020 census. It's merely the latest step in a long history of our innovation and continuous improvement of our privacy protections. And it's necessary to counter 21st century threats. So there's a common misperception that aggregating data is sufficient to protect privacy. While that may have once been the case, and may still be true for some limited data releases, it's not sufficient to protect privacy in large-scale statistical data products. In fact, aggregate tabular data can often be thought of like a giant Sudoku. With Sudoku, if you have enough numbers pre-populated in the grid, there's one and only one solution to the puzzle. When you publish enough data tables, eventually there's one and only one set of individual level records that could have yielded the published tabular results. It might have seemed unthinkable years ago, but computer algorithms can do this reconstruction of individual level records from aggregate tabular data quite easily today. And then once you have the database reconstructed, attackers can work on re-identification. It turns out that this is also a fairly easy exercise. While the reconstructed records don't have individuals' names, they did have a number of pseudo-identifiers or linkable fields that can be used to link to an outside data source that does have the names. So this is a very simple example showing how age and sex can match reconstructed records to third-party data, and now you can learn Jane, Joe, and John's race and relationship status. This is reconstruction, re-identification are not just theoretical. There have been a lot of published cases of this in the news that many people have actually taken it as a challenge to try to attempt to do this with public data sets. So it's a real threat. Enough so that the Census Bureau undertook our own test to see if we could reconstruct data from the 2010 census. So this 2010 census collected a handful of attributes. For those of you who remember, we asked the 10 questions on the form. But we have asked it of 309 people in the US, so that gives us 1.9 billion confidential data points. And we released over 150 billion aggregate statistics derived from that data. So we wanted to see, is our data at risk? And it was an emphatic yes. In fact, only using a small portion of the 2010 public data products, we were able to reconstruct individual level data for all 6 million inhabited blocks in the US. Moreover, we were able to reconstruct detailed individual level information, including sex and age to within a year, race and ethnicity for 71% of the entire population. And then linking these reconstructed records to commercially available data from the period, we were able to confirm an accurate re-identification on all variables for 52 million individuals. So you can see why this was a concern. So differential privacy, which I mentioned is also called formal privacy, is a way we can quantify the precise amount of privacy risk for every calculation, table, and data product that we want to publish, no matter what third-party data people throw at us. In a slightly different way, formal privacy is an approach that allows you to precisely measure and mitigate the leakage of private information in your published statistics. So by quantifying that risk, known in the differential privacy literature as the sensitivity of the calculation, differential privacy allows us to mitigate that risk to an acceptable level by injecting precisely calibrated statistically neutral noise or uncertainty into the calculation. There are a lot of different privacy naysayers who say it will destroy the usability of data compared to traditional privacy protection techniques. But let me be clear, when comparing differential privacy with traditional disclosure avoidance techniques, neither approach is inherently better than the other from the perspective of data accuracy. It all depends on their implementation and parameters. Where differential privacy and traditional methods do differ is that formal privacy provides quantifiable and future-proof guarantees that the traditional methods cannot. So what are the implications for the 2020 census? All data products other than apportionment, but including the PL 94-171 redistricting data, will have these privacy protections applied as they have in prior censuses. Only this time the noise will come from differential privacy rather than record swapping mechanism we've used in the past. In order to get the same level of privacy protection using record swapping, the Census Bureau would have to have swapped so many records, it would have rendered the data unusable. The switch to differential privacy does require us to reevaluate the quantity of the statistics and tables that we'll be releasing, which is sort of the allusion I was making to the demographic housing and characteristic file not being exactly the same as summary file 1, because each additional statistic or table uses up a fraction of the privacy loss budget. Consequently, the proposed suite of 2020 products will be different from what it was in the past. So as we've developed our privacy algorithms, we've been working to ensure that we can meet the Census Bureau and the public's expectations. Last fall, we did a test to see if we could scale the system up so it could run the entire 2020 census. And in doing so, we wanted to make sure that it could also effectively protect privacy at that scale. And we also wanted to start evaluating the data being put out by that system for fitness of use for the major uses of the decennial census. The initiative was largely successful, but it did show us that there was a lot of work that needed to be done. So the October version of this output fell short on several areas. There were issues with the population count for political geographies, population counts for American Indian Alaska Native areas. There were some biases in which population was being moved from urban areas to rural areas. And then there were some real issues with housing statistics around vacancy rates, with some areas having 100% occupancy and other areas that are traditionally high vacancy rates being filled up. And these come from two major things. One, there's the error that we know we're introducing through the use of differential privacy. But once that differential privacy is applied, we have to do something called post-processing. And post-processing introduces its own error. This is the conversion of the differentially private data into something that we would recognize as an expected data source, such as whole persons and non-negative people, that type of work. To continue this work, the Census Bureau has committed to releasing what we're calling privacy protected microdata files. We did not have at this time in the decennial cycle, the ability to continue to create a demonstration data set like we did in October. So instead, we're releasing these privacy protected microdata files, which although they look like individual person records, they're actually protected by the differential privacy mechanism. And so if you have the ability to process over 300 million records, you can take this and you can create any type of tabulation for any level of geography that you so choose based on out of the 2010 census data and compare it to your other use cases. And in addition, knowing that a lot of people, myself included, don't have the tools to be able to process a 300 million record file, the IPUMS NHGIS group have actually tabulated several of the files that are most used and have them posted to their website. So we are trying to be as transparent as we can about this and keep the public up to date and our data users up to date on this. We're consistently posting blogs and newsletters around this, information around the PPMFs that I just mentioned, and this is the locations where you would find that. And I just want to say thank you, and I appreciate the chance to come and speak to you today.
Hey, great, James. We did have a couple of questions come in, so I'm just going to go ahead and give those to you now. One asked regarding how that data is going to come back to the states. So to talk a little bit more about the package that they're going to be getting, as well as some of the aspects with some of the, since citizenship question was not asked, there has been this effort to try to do some administrative data with citizenship. So could you talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, so the data itself, specifically the redistricting data, gets delivered to official recipients by both DVD, flash drive, which also has a software package that sits on top of the data, which allows for easy browsing and access of specific geographies and queries, and also exporting of the data into specific geographic levels that we thought would be of interest to the redistricting community. Those will be delivered to the official recipients, which, as I mentioned, was the governor, the state legislative leadership, and any redistricting commission that exists. And then they also will have the option to look at this data in the data.census.gov platform the day before it gets turned on for the country to also receive that data. We also have the traditional summary file, which is a text-based file, which are really sort of flat tables that you need to pull in and link together in a relational database, which you can then do queries and access any geography or any data that's contained in the redistricting data files. We're looking also to see if we can put the software that we're putting on the disk that goes to the official recipients onto an FTP drive as well, because it doesn't require an installation. So we may be able to make that accessible, but we have to see if we can put something like that on our FTP due to security concerns, since it does still run as an executable. As far as the citizenship, the way the 2020 census CVAP is being created is we're using the 2020 census frame, and then we're using a collection of administrative records that we've collected under the authority of the executive order that was asked other agencies to provide census with those administrative records to make a determination of whether someone is a citizen of voting age to put into that table. That table is using the structure that we obtained from the Department of Justice when they asked us in 2011 for creating that table from the ACS for Section 2 enforcement of the Voting Rights Act.
Okay, well, that's great information to have. I'm going to hold the other questions because they might pertain to Elizabeth as well. So let me introduce our next speaker, Elizabeth Garner. She's the state demographer for Colorado. And she has 25 years of experience in analyzing and researching population and economic trends. She's recently been leading the Colorado 2020 census efforts, including researching these impacts of differential privacy, as well as managing their complete count committee and heading up their outreach and marketing campaign. I saw a presentation that Elizabeth gave earlier this year on differential privacy, and it was really eye-opening to me, and that's why I wanted to have her join our conference to share what she's learned and update things. Their census has made changes since earlier this year, but this will bring you up to speed for where that research stands right now. So Elizabeth, welcome to the Nebraska State Data Conference.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be with you guys. And again, appreciate being able to share the stage with James as well. He was actually the very first person that we worked with to get ready for 2020. So it's nice to see you, whatever, 5 years later, 6 years later since we started. And again, thank you, David. And I appreciate being invited to participate with Nebraska. Let me share my screen real quick. And make sure that everybody can see what I've got. Does that look good? All right, perfect. So what I'm going to talk about is really how this impact of differential privacy on user implications, which I think is going to be really important for all of the data users in Nebraska. I don't think the states are that different in terms of implications of small size, as well as some places and counties that are very small. And I think differential privacy has had an issue with those areas especially. And so just to touch on a couple of things that James had mentioned, just remember, I know that probably a lot of you have either no experience or a ton of experience with this disclosure avoidance system. And what I would really recommend is learning a lot more if you don't, because it really is a huge trade-off between accuracy and privacy. And I agree wholeheartedly with what James was saying in terms of the privacy side, but I'm a data user, and so I am definitely more of a proponent on the accuracy side and fearful of what we're going to be losing. Definitely along the board here, there are still a lot of private policy decisions that need to be made in terms of how much noise is going to be added, what's going to be left as invariant, meaning as counted. Definitely, and I think it'll hit home here for this group, right now, population and households are being treated as almost two separate entities, which is wreaking havoc with the output. And I'm going to guess that most of you look at information as households, not just as individuals. So that, I think, is a huge impact. And then really think about what the decennial census is created for, which I think James is lucky. I think in most of those cases, it's there's a lot of legal ramifications for it to be good for both redistricting and reapportionment. So he might end up with the best data out there for his causes. But I think that that does call into question why the rest of us use the data. So I will be focusing mostly on what this means for your users, and how you can submit some feedback and play and test with the data. So as James mentioned, that first set of data was released back in October, and hands down, when compared to the summary file 1 data, it fell short. The Census Bureau agreed, we looked at it, agreed, definitely problems with that first round of applying the disclosure avoidance to it. At the same time, the Census Bureau realized they're not going to be able to release a lot of data out into the future, other data sets very similar to this. So one of the additional things that they've done is created a series of metrics that are available online on the Differential Privacy website that you can look at, that shows what the different sprints, which I would say different scenarios or different efforts that they're trying to look at improving some of the problems, can see what's going on. So I'll talk a little bit about that. James also mentioned that privacy protected microdata file, which I'm going to go over a couple of the outcomes from that. Definitely still falls short, in my opinion, from what we really want to be able to see. Some improvements, but definitely some worse outcomes for us. And again, I think won't reiterate enough the importance of data users like us submitting cases and situations to the Census Bureau now, as soon as possible, showing the implications of what this means, because this is how the census learns on what they need to still work on before the data is released. Once it's released, it's too late. So again, October 1st results, definitely census admits they weren't good enough. Size of geography matters, and distribution within a state really matters. And that's why I think this is important for Nebraska. When you've got a lot of small and a lot of big, it wreaks havoc with those outcomes, because again, the Census Bureau is going to hold as enumerated the state total. And that's it in terms of population, not necessarily at a county level, not at sub-county level. And so when you've got a big disparity between large and small, that does create problems. Definitely this urban to rural bias, which I'll show you some pictures of, and then some crazy unreasonable results. Household size, smaller than 1, families with children but no adults present, population counts but no housing units available, occupied housing units but no population, and then, like as James mentioned, like 100% occupancy, which in a lot of areas makes no sense. And again, this is a significant problem because of this separation between population and households. And you might be thinking to yourself, I don't really understand what she means. I don't understand why she's saying this. But just imagine, I mean, if you took like a total population of your state, but it didn't matter on the number of occupied housing units or the number of vacant housing units, how would you allocate all of that population to all of the housing units? What would be that household size? And that is what's going awry with current issues. Also a big issue is the problem with geographies with large GQs. when they're doing this differential privacy, they're not separating GQ population from household population. And I don't know if Nebraska is the same as Colorado, but we've got some counties where over 50% of the population is a prison. And then they're mixing the prison pop with the household pop. It wreaks havoc on age distribution, race and ethnicity. And so these are issues that I think the Census Bureau still needs to deal with. And what I'm really hoping for is that they'll separate the DP, the differential privacy, from household population from the GQ population, because again, GQs are different. They're different from the total population. Their age distribution, whether it's a university, a prison, a nursing home, they are different than the rest of the population that they're typically involved in. So one of the first slides to show you, or graphics to show you, is this is looking at the very first summary file 1 versus the first DP that they did in October. And just because I've got a second one to show you, you can see the 2 arrows at the bottom. The purple one is Colorado. Nebraska is green next to it, arrow. So we're right next to each other. And this is looking at the percentage difference by place between the SF1 and this DP file. And so basically what it's saying is that we've got about a 20%, and Nebraska has over 20% difference at the place level on average in the total population. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, yeah, but we're a small state. Well, no, I mean, yeah, Nebraska's pretty small in terms of total population. Colorado, pretty big, 5.3 million or 5.03 million in 2010. But look at the states that we're surrounded by. Other Western states with larger geography and a likelihood that you'd have a bigger differentiation between small and large communities. You can see over on the far right, those that have the fewest errors aren't necessarily the biggest states. Some of them are there, but there's also smaller states, and it's just that they're more equal in size. And so this is a huge difference. And imagine poor Alaska, over almost 50% of the places on average, or of the places, over 50%, almost 50% differential in that place total population. This is just to show the urban-rural differential. This is the map of Colorado. These are the counties. That blue segment across the center, that light blue here, this is the Front Range. This is where the total population is. This is the Front Range where the largest counties are. What we can see here is that the largest population areas with the DP lost population, and these red and pink counties are those that received population. And so this distribution from large to small also happened within the state. And I'm guessing the same situation happened in Nebraska as well. Over on that far left side, we've got Mesa County. It's another urban center within the state, and so that's why it's out there as well. Certainly implications for redistricting. We can see the same thing happen. This is again the map of Colorado, where we can see population leaving, and these are the state Senate districts, leaving the urban corridor going out to the rural parts of the state. So the rural areas gaining, and those rural districts gaining, and the urban ones losing. And so again, something to be thinking about when we're doing redistricting. And then this is again another crazy issue with that disconnection between households and housing units. As I had mentioned, the urban area lost population, the rural area gained population, but oddly enough, vice versa happened on household size. Household size actually increased in the urban area and decreased in the rural. So imagine you're trying to explain to someone that the rural population actually increased, but that household size decreased. Makes no sense. So again, serious issues with that relationship. And so far, that's not been one of the improvements, is looking at that household and housing unit relationship. So just real quickly, I want to talk about a couple of the metrics that are out there. This is, I think, a great tool, and it's understandable why the Census Bureau created this series of metrics for people to use to evaluate how these different sprints are being improved and the outcome of that. So there's a whole website, and you can see it at the bottom. I'm guessing these slides are going to be made available to you. You can see where these metrics are, and that information is out there so that you can see what's been improved over time, which I think is really helpful. This is an example of one of the metric tables. This is looking at the mean absolute error. The very first column of numbers starting from the left-hand side says DEM-P. That was the run in October. And then the subsequent runs you can see going across the top, 1, 2, 3, etc., and a 1W, a 2W, etc. What we can see is then, for example, all counties had a mean absolute error of 82.1 on that first run. Then we can see across the different iterations how they've been improved or worsened. So we can see those first two runs, run 1 and 1W, almost across the spectrum, things worsened. So they're like, yeah, that didn't work. Over time, though, you can see how things have improved. Now, personally, this is going to be probably very helpful to the Census Bureau in improving the algorithms. But for me, as a state demographer for Colorado, this means absolutely nothing. It does not matter to me that all counties less than 1,000 are improving. I want to know how Colorado's counties are doing. And I know that sounds really selfish, but that's what I care about. I care about how are things going to look for Colorado, because I know the distribution between large and small within a state also matters. So James talked about this PPMF, this privacy protected microdata file. It was released. IPUMS did a great job of releasing the data, made it easier for all of us to use. We've been able to do some studies on how that looks. I'm going to present a couple of those findings right here. Definitely on that total population number, so James is winning right now, have improved. And so, and I think that's important to know, one, what's the ultimate goal of the census and where we're seeing some improvements. However, differentials in size within a state is still an issue. Urban to rural bias, still an issue. Unreasonable results, still an issue. Again, haven't dealt with the issue of households and housing units, and still not dealing separately with group quarters. And I'll show you those implications. So remember the first slide I showed you. Now on this one, so what I showed you, the first one, are really these orange lines. The improvement is now this revised one is the blue line, is the blue bars. Purple is still Colorado here, green is over here Nebraska. And what you can see is that there has been some improvement. So for example, Colorado had an improvement with where the average difference was 20%. Now it's about 15%. Certainly improvements for example, Alaska, improving from 45% average error to 32%. Nebraska, barely any improvement over here, a little bit above 20% to 20%. So we can see that distribution within a state is still a significant issue. Where you've got areas that have large populations and small populations, we're still seeing those implications across the board. So still something that needs to be improved on within the algorithms. What has actually happened is age has gotten worse. And these are just a couple of slides to show that. I don't know if any of the work that people do in Nebraska, I'm sure there's a lot of work that you guys do related to age, where these implications are coming up. So the outlined bar is what was published, the Census 2010 data. The colored component is this second set, this PPMF file with the differential privacy. So what we can see is huge differences in age. And Grand Lake is a kind of a resort area up in the mountains, has lots of youth that need to be working, and absolutely no 25 to 29-year-olds with the new file. Huge overestimate or over indication here with the number of 60 to 64-year-olds. Then some odd male-female things going on at older ages especially, but also at younger ages. So definitely some worsening in terms of age distribution. Here's another example where we're seeing and definitely what we've seen in Colorado, and this would be something interesting to test in Nebraska as well, is over the age of 65. Definitely is our area of largest errors, but this is another one of our counties. This is actually one of our smaller counties, about 1,800 people in the county as a whole. But what we can see is this, again, huge differential. And so when we're talking about accuracy, we're also talking about accuracy that makes sense. I know that some of the Census Bureau will end up saying, yeah, but you don't really know if 2010 was right. And it's like, yeah, but you can definitely look into a community and know if it's right or not. And some of the findings that we're seeing here are unreasonable. Here's another one. This is in Crowley County. It's actually one of our prison population counties. And again, what we would expect with the total population is a lot of, especially males in these kind of 20 to 30-year-old age group, being then underestimated, and then more folks being moved into kind of the 65 plus, or especially the 85 plus. So some weird errors on that end. So these are some tools that you can look at, and some of the, and actually this is a GitHub application that if you need, you can connect with me and we can forward this information. Some folks have developed this. It's really easy to apply to your own data set, and you can look at what your own Nebraska's data would look in this same piece. Age distribution, as I mentioned, is a huge implication. One of the things that I think is important to see is how it might impact funding formulas. So this is, we've got an area agency on aging within the state. We do a funding formula for them. It looks at the population 60 plus, 75 plus, 60 plus in minority, and 60 plus in rural. And what we can see are the different outcomes. So the very first column here where it says SF 2010 is looking at a distribution of $20 million in dollars, how those dollars would be distributed within these different regions. DP 2010 is that release from October, and how it changed those distributions, where again, kind of what you would expect, it decreased allocations from urban areas and allocated them more to rural areas. Then we look at the PPMF distribution, and it was worse. Those changes were even larger under that PPMF release. So again, if you have, there could be implications on how you distribute funding within your state based again on these implications. From that, we use the 2010 SF file to do this, and it may be saying this is no longer a tool, a resource that can be used for some of these funding formulas. I will go over again, I think I probably reiterated enough why I don't like it in terms of the GQ. This is showing New York has done some fabulous work in terms of analyzing the impacts. And I've sourced the person down there, Jan Vink, if anybody knows him, amazing analyst, looking at some of these implications. This is a tool that he created showing all of the correctional facilities within New York and the implications between the different outcomes. And what I find astounding is that this is not something that the Census Bureau is already looking at. How can we have correctional facilities with 0 to 5-year-olds, 5 to 9-year-olds, 10 to 15-year-olds in them? These are adult correctional facilities. that now under, so the dark outline is the PPMF file. The light color on the inside is the SF1 file. You know, unreasonable. Likewise, in other outcomes that we saw from correctional facilities is that there are 30-year-olds and older in juvenile facilities, population under 14 as well as under 5, and folks over 70 in student dorms. Also population under 14 and over 60 in military barracks. Again, this is a concern, and it should be a concern for a lot of people, and making sure that the Census Bureau improves these components, and especially as James mentioned, that they do a release of the redistricting file with and without that prison population, because some of us have to change them up for doing redistricting and voting. So this is, I think, an important outcome to look at. Likewise, this is again looking at a prison issue within Colorado. One of our counties has a lot of correctional facilities. If we look at the right graph, there is a big circle, and those yellow dots are where we've got some big prisons. They tend to be a lot more diverse. To explain some of the color coding on that left-hand side, it looks at the percent minority in each block. And so these blocks over here in the red and yellow tend to have a higher percent minority. And it makes sense because these are prisons, and I don't want to get into that implication, but that tends to be the case, especially in Colorado, where we've got a higher minority share in the prisons. And then we can look at the left hand, same circles around those correctional facilities. But what happened is that with that PPMF, it's distributed the race that was concentrated primarily in the prisons out to the rest of the county, or the rest of, and this is Canyon City, so it's a city. And so I think that is a serious problem with, again, the methodology that's being used to protect our privacy. Again, lots of weird outcomes still out there. There are over 10,000 blocks with children under 5, yet no women, 18 to 44, so no moms. 38,000 blocks with people all the same sex. 5,800 blocks with only population under the age of 14. So, you know, crazy times going on there. Male prisons with only females, or a mix of both male and female. And again, no work has been really done to resolve the household to housing unit issues. Last thing I'm going to bring up is this, and this may be going too into the weeds, but the way that the information is being allocated, we're able to look at records of individual records in the data. And this is a tally of the frequency of the same individual record. So like with me, white woman that's 54. There are what they're calling quintuplets, showing 22 million records that appear 5 times in a block. So like in my own block, that would end up being 5 different individuals that look exactly like me. So again, some very unreasonable outcomes in the way that this methodology is being used. Just real quickly, you can now imagine implications across the board where this is going to be an issue: redistricting, financial distributions, vital stats. If you're looking at rates, which I know in our state, that's what, you know, they use the census data as the denominator. Population to household relationship, rural, urban, population estimates. Just even coming up with population estimates in the future, I think, are going to be a challenge. Looking at population forecasts, certainly a challenge. If we don't know age and race by county, how do we plan on doing any of our population projections, as well as doing any type of time series work? If you have no idea what I'm talking about and you want more of an explanation of what differential privacy is, this is a really fun YouTube video. It's kind of a cartoon talking about what differential privacy is. these are all of the different resources that are out there. The first one is the Census Bureau's website, the IPUM site that has the data on it. NCSL has done a great page describing what's going on, as well as Esri has created some maps and some story maps in terms of explaining it. Biggest piece though, please supply some feedback. And this is the email to supply that feedback to. And timing is huge. Now that everything has been moved up and you heard the timelines that James explained, Census Bureau needs to hear from you today in terms of what these implications could be across the board. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David.
Yeah, thanks. And we've had some questions come through, so I'll pose this one to you, Elizabeth. I know in the prior presentation back earlier this year, you talked a little bit about credibility and usability in the data. So how are you seeing some of the biggest impacts for the types of work that you do or that Nebraska data users can expect for credibility in the data and its usability?
Yeah, I think it's a big question, unfortunately. And I don't know how we'll know how right it is until we share it and look at it and compare it to our 2010 or 2019 estimates to see potentially how wrong it could be. I think the biggest problem is that, and I had a year, 2 years, year and a half denial going on, thinking Census would never do this. Census will never release anything bad. And now I'm really concerned, and I don't know how we're going to be able to prove it and how it's going to be able to be reliably used. I'm very scared.
Okay, and then along those lines for both yourself and James, talk a little bit about some of the reiterations that have happened since last October. What can we expect going forward? Kind of what's the process for differential privacy? And are there plans to put it on other products such as the ACS?
So, the work on the disclosure avoidance system, and I think Elizabeth did a really good job of sort of identifying and highlighting what some of the difficulties and challenges that are still lie ahead in the development of the disclosure avoidance system, because the Census Bureau is committed to putting out data that's fit for use for multiple uses, not just for the redistricting data. I argue often for redistricting data for accuracy around total population and then the racial characteristics that are included in the file, because it's being used to affect people's everyday lives and their ability to vote and exercise their constitutional rights. But there's a lot of other data that the Census Bureau produces from the decennial census that I think Elizabeth did a good job of highlighting that really affect the way people live and work and apply programs and institute government for the nation. So we are committed to creating data that's fit for use. The work is ongoing. We'll be creating new versions of the PPMF to try to demonstrate that we're making progress. We will be transparent in announcing things like what we decide to keep invariant when we go through the process. We'll also be looking at where we set the epsilon. These current runs are using an epsilon of 4 for the person records and 2 for the housing records. So we'll be looking at that because at the end of the day, our goal is to have something that is fit for use and people can have the confidence in working with that they've had with census data in the past.
Okay, and here's one for Elizabeth. What can local governments or more individual data users do to prepare as they get ready for the census data to come out with differential privacy allocated?
So I would recommend playing with some of the PPMF data to look at what those implications are. I know that what was released is not going to be the final. I know that they're still working on making improvements, but it's important to understand where there could be issues. And so a couple of the things that we're doing in Colorado is we're actually going to start doing a much better job with our own estimates. We're going to do a much better job looking at our housing units, our occupancy and vacancy of our housing units, because I think that that's going to go awry. And certainly working a lot more even on our own population estimates counts. So not every state does their own individual population estimate counts because they rely on the Census Bureau to do them. And so if you are needing things at the municipal or let's say school district or other special district level, you may be looking at other methods to create those estimates or see what additional data might be out there that you can use to supplement some of the issues that we may find. I know one of the questions that came up is asked if there's a person like me in Nebraska. And, so obviously I think David is one of your key connections. As well, it says Pam Bonebright. Do you know Pam?
Yeah, Pam is our person who does our population estimates. She's with Department of Natural Resources.
So I would be working with her as well as David to understand what the implications could be. Certainly, if you need assistance, if Colorado can be any assistance and kind of set you guys up with tools to do some evaluation. I know that there are other folks like myself, as well as like New York, that have, I just asked New York for just feedback, and he ended up giving me a whole spreadsheet of everything. So he might be a really good resource as well to look at what these implications could be like for Nebraska as well. But reach out to us and others, maybe Pam as well, to see what these implications could be. But certainly looking at rates, like I don't know if your Department of maybe Health that might be looking at birth and death rates, that's going to be a big implication. Funding formulas, those are the two big ones that we're worrying about.
Sure. Okay, and there's one final question for James to wrap up. You weren't able to give us a ton of detail regarding the timing of our census release, but I think if you could recap for us one more time the major data releases and when you think they're going to happen so that people can be prepared for these first couple of products to come out.
So the apportionment counts will be out by the end of the year. So that will be by 12/31 of 2020. The redistricting data, we're putting together the schedule with a target date of completing it by our statutory deadline of March 31st of 2021. The next two products that would come out would be the demographic profiles and the demographic housing and characteristic file, which is this replacement of summary file 1 that folks can look forward to. And that we're trying to keep that along the same timeline as what we did in 2010, so later in that spring and summer of the year. Of course, with the reconfiguring of schedules multiple times, we may have to push that out a little bit, but that's what our goal is we're trying to keep with the same cadence of deliveries that we did for 2010. And I do want to just add one little thing. If you do analyze the PPMF and look at it for your personal use cases and you want to provide feedback, I know Elizabeth had a web address there at the end of her in her presentation, but we've also sort of created a vanity address to make it easier for people to remember, which is just 2020DAS@census.gov, and that goes to the same inbox so that people can give their feedback, because data user feedback is really the primary driver of how we know how to focus our attention on what needs to be fixed as we go forward.
Okay. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
And one thing I was just going to bring up, David, because I know it came up in one of the questions that it asked if differential privacy is going to be applied to other products, and the answer is yes. Right now, the ACS has a reprieve, I think, of 5 years. So I don't know how it got lucky. Maybe they just don't know how to apply it to the ACS. So that's one thing to keep using as long as it's still out there, but even population estimates. So what we receive as estimates from the Census Bureau will also be DP'd out into the future, I think starting this year. So we will be living in a new world. And I think that's something for all of us to try and get ready for.
Yeah, that's why we have to keep it top of mind, and the reason why I wanted to bring you both on. You're both experts in what you do, James on the census side and yourself regarding demographic data, Elizabeth. So I think you've given us some wonderful information, and we're going to go ahead and close this session out for now. But we will be back here at 2 o'clock for our popular state and local population trends session for Nebraska. So we'll get into that material then. But thanks so much for your participation, and enjoy your lunch.